Hey, folks, thanks for being here. I am joined for the hour by none other than Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Chris Hedges. We'll be talking about a lot of things, but especially his newest book, The Greatest Evil is War. And yeah, it's hopefully amazing conversation. This is the first of these hour-long interviews that I'm doing, so I'm excited to start it with Mint Press. Behind the headlines is the video platform that Mint Press has created. So you see that BTH in the corner, and that's what that is. But here is his new book, The Greatest Evil is War. And please leave a comment in the comment thread. If we have a chance, we will get to some of those questions for Chris. But yeah, let's get started. Hey, Chris.
Hey, Lee, how are you?
Thanks so much for being here. I know these are crazy times and crazy busy times, but I appreciate it. Since we're going to spend some time on your new book, but since we're on election day here, I might as well start with I promise my one and only question about that. Today's election day. It's the midterms. We know the two parties agree on 80 to 90% of the structural issues of this country. There's hardly any difference on foreign policy. I mean, the couple of members of Congress who've stood up against the proxy war in Ukraine or even want oversight of the funding of it seem to be Republicans. And we know from a large Princeton study that Americans get nothing passed through Congress that doesn't agree or align with corporate America. So I just thought I'd start off by saying, do these midterms matter?
Well, I wrote a column for my Substack site that SharePost, Alternate, and a few other places picked up called "The Politicians Who Destroyed Our Democracy Want Us to Vote for Them to Save It." And then I went on to list what Biden and the Democratic Party have done over the last few decades to further or essentially solidify this corporate coup d'etat. And this is why, of course, Gore Vidal called us the United States of Amnesia, because we don't get it on the press. These campaigns are quite sophisticated about creating fictional feel-good personas for candidates. Remember, everybody wanted to have a beer with George W. Bush. Political campaigns just become a day at the races. A kind of perversion of ESPN. And you're right, on every major issue, from trade deals to war to wholesale surveillance, there's no daylight between Democrats and Republicans. So the establishment parties, now the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, have fused into one party. It's how you have Robert Reich calling for Liz Cheney, who's campaigning for Democrats, to run for president. It shows you how tight they always were, essentially battling back against these uncontrollable forces of white hate and militias and that coalesced around Trump and seized control of the party. But this is what happens in decayed societies. It's what I witnessed in the former Yugoslavia. But if you go back and look, at the wreckage that the mainstream Democrats and Republicans visited on the country, it becomes understandable, and not excusable in the way that rage is expressed, but understandable why that rage is there. Remember, it's Biden who gave us Clarence Thomas and discredited and humiliated Anita Hill. It's Biden who gave us the endless wars, and the Democrats in tandem with the Republicans in the Middle East. In fact, Biden was calling 5 years before the invasion of Iraq to, quote, take Saddam down. And then, of course, he's rehabilitated Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman after the assassination of my colleague and friend, Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post columnist. He's long been a fervent supporter of the apartheid state of Israel. And in fact, calls himself a Zionist. He, for the last 2 decades, has received lavish funding from AIPAC and the Israel lobby. He fought against school busing, arguing that segregation was beneficial for blacks. He passed all sorts of punitive laws against the poor, particularly African Americans, such as the Comprehensive Crime Control Act, which he sponsored with Strom Thurmond, which eliminated parole for federal prisoners, limited the amount of time sentences could be reduced for good behavior. He was behind the 1994 crime bill, which he drafted it, and again used this language Hillary Clinton had used about super predators. That bill expanded the death penalty, mandated life imprisonment for third violent felony. These are the three strikes or outlaws. That more than doubled the prison's population. He put over 100,000 new police on the streets. 1996 Anti-Terrorism Effective Death Penalty Act that gutted the federal writ of habeas corpus, abolished most rights for death row prisoners, mandated harsh federal sentencing. He helped write the 2001 Patriot Act that allows the government to monitor our phone and email communications, collect bank and credit card reports, etc. Destruction of welfare, cuts to Social Security, NAFTA. He backed the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act. That eliminated key defenses against deportation. He's long been an opponent of abortion. He was at the forefront of deregulating the banking industry, abolition of Glass-Steagall, has been a tool of the for-profit insurance and pharmaceutical industry that gave him, the pharmaceutical industry alone gave him $6.3 million to his 2020 presidential campaign. That was 4 times what gave Trump. Of course, the military budget, it's every year it's ratcheted up. And what we don't talk about are the human costs of this, not only for the poor, not only for workers, not only for the shrinking middle class, but for millions of people in the Middle East, families ripped apart by mass incarceration, millions of families forced into bankruptcy by this for-profit medical system, the opioid crisis, hundreds of thousands of dead, the slashing of welfare. And what they did, 70% of the original recipients of welfare were children. So this is the disastrous debacle after debacle, assault after assault, both in terms of endless war and in terms of a domestic kind of dismantling of the most basic government programs, has essentially hollowed the country out from the inside, very similar to what I saw in Yugoslavia. And then you vomit up these figures like DeSantis and Cruz and Trump and everyone else. But they become the expression of a legitimate rage, a legitimate betrayal. And that's, of course, I think we're about to see tomorrow, the manifestation of that. It's to understand is not to condone. But the problem is that the Democratic Party and the establishment Republican Party are wholly responsible for the political deformities that are now about to be visited upon us.
Yeah, well said. And your litany of I'll call them charges against Biden, it reminded me that he did a couple of things here before the midterms to try and basically grab some votes in the last minute. And, 2 of them were releasing, pardoning prisoners who were convicted of federal simple marijuana possession, which was, a few hundred people or maybe over a few thousand, but currently there are 0 in prison for that charge. So he pardoned 0 people that are currently in prison. And then and the other one was the student debt forgiveness for certain people, certain amounts, etc. There's a lot of caveats, but for both of those things, Biden was none of the mainstream media or many people that I saw were talking about how Biden was trying to undo or appear to undo crimes he himself had committed. I mean, he had locked these people, helped lock these people up with the crime bill. He had, like you said, he is funded by these credit card companies and the big banks, and so he helped force through the bill that wouldn't allow people to declare bankruptcy from student loan debt. So he's undoing, or trying to appear to undo, some of the things he himself is guilty of creating.
Well, I might be able to forgive him if he was really undoing anything.
Yeah.
These are token, symbolic gestures, which do nothing to mitigate what student debt, $1.7 trillion. I don't know what the latest figure is. It's massive.
Yeah.
People are just crippled by this debt peonage, and consumer, of course, debt is now, especially with inflation, very high. He's not trying to undo anything. These are publicity stunts, for giving $10,000. Well, sure. I mean, but it doesn't in any way mitigate the crippling, onerous debt peonage that has been visited, especially on poor people that got sucked into the scam of believing that if they got some kind of a college degree, they could get some kind of a decent paying job. I was very involved in Zuccotti Park at Occupy, and these were largely kids burdened by student debt who got out of school and realized there was nothing for them.
Yeah. Yeah. Like you said, just token gestures. So this is the first or second time I've talked to you since we both lost TV shows at RT America. That was the third outlet, I believe. Maybe there's even another one I'm not thinking of, but third outlet that you've lost in recent years. Two of them, I was there with you. In the case of Truthdig and RT America, the entire outlet was shuttered in many ways just to stop certain truths from coming out. In the third case, you were essentially forced out by the New York Times for taking a stance against the Iraq War after winning a Pulitzer Prize, no less. Are these three events essentially proof that the system will eventually, come after or purge the journalists or outlets that reveal the reality behind the corporate state?
Well, there are four, actually, Lee. You're right about the New York Times, and then Telesur. I had a show on Telesur, and then the governments, it was a consortium of five Latin American governments, Ecuador, Argentina, etc. They went right wing, and they slashed the funding, so that went off the air. And then RT picked up the Telesur show and repackaged it,
right?
And then Truthdig. I think what we see is that because the ruling class has lost its credibility across the political spectrum, critics who may not have a particularly large megaphone are more threatening because they are exposing a truth or truths about how corrupt and venal this system has become, what Sheldon Wolin calls our system of inverted totalitarianism. So yes, they become prime targets where, in a way, if the system had more self-confidence and wasn't so universally despised, those critics would be left alone, because we're already knocked off of the mainstream. I mean, you and I know why they went after RT. It wasn't because of Russian propaganda. I didn't do any shows on Russia. And yet, of course, after they took RT off the air, the 6 years of my archives, I believe yours too, were erased by YouTube. Well, why? Well, it's because it was all laid out in the 2017 Director of National Intelligence report, where they devoted about 7 pages to RT. And it wasn't complaining about Russian propaganda. It was complaining that RT was giving a platform, these are their words, to Black Lives Matter activists, anti-fracking activists, third-party candidates, anti-imperialists, supporters of Julian Assange, etc. And that's why RT was shut down, which didn't have much of a media footprint in the first place. It's why my shows and yours were erased from YouTube. And I think that as the ruling elites become more frightened, and essentially the establishment Republican Party and the establishment Democratic Party are now one party, uh, uh, they will reach for harsher and harsher forms of censorship rather than addressing the structural inequities that have created the political swamp that we currently live in.
Yeah, yeah. Well, luckily, you are still allowed to publish your books, which are excellent, and I have thoroughly enjoyed the latest one, "The Greatest Evil is War," and I the book does a great job of kind of showing the reader the on the ground reality of how gruesome war is. I think our modern American population, most of whom have never seen war up close and personal, including me, but many of them, or most of them, tend to use reductive terminology like "we invaded Iraq" or "we use shock and awe" or "the troop surge in Afghanistan." And these things serve to dehumanize these events and also drain them of the gory and horrific reality. And I feel like your book colors in that picture. So can you talk a little about that?
Right. So I had my first book, War is the Force That Gives Us Meaning, was written out of my own experiences for 20 years as a war correspondent in Latin America. I covered the wars in El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, 7 years in the Middle East. I covered the war in the former Yugoslavia and Bosnia and Kosovo, and then lots of wars in between. I was in Sudan. I covered the civil war in Yemen. Unfortunately, I picked the losing side. I was in the South. Uh, the Congo, I mean, Algeria after the coup in 91. So I was in many, many conflicts, and I wrote a book about that familiarity with the culture of war. Uh, and it was a horrible experience, not cathartic in any way. It was very painful, not something I wanted to repeat. I didn't expect the book to sell, particularly, neither did the publisher, especially with this very ungainly title, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. But it exploded. It hit the particular zeitgeist with the calls to invade Iraq, and sold hundreds of thousands of copies. Uh, and then big publishers came and wanted me to sign another contract to write another book on war, which I wouldn't do. For them, it was all about money. I said what I had to say, and I also didn't want to get ghettoized as a writer, where I'd spend the rest of my life like Rick Atkinson, who writes good stuff, but I just didn't want to write the rest of my life about war. So
Right.
I refused, and I did do a couple books. I did a book primarily aimed at teenagers, modeled on a World War I anti-war book called "What Every Person Should Know About War," where we use military studies to answer the most basic questions about war. And the Quakers use that book on anti-recruiting tables in high schools, which I'm quite happy about. And then I did a long investigative piece for The Nation, where we interviewed, I and the journalist Layla El Arian interviewed 50 combat veterans from Iraq about atrocities they had either committed or witnessed, which got huge play. I mean, excerpted in major papers in Europe, uh, and then are virtually ignored, obviously, in the United States. So it's not like I hadn't written on war, but I didn't write on my own war again. And then I saw all this cheerleading for Ukraine by people who are quite willing to see other people die for their uh, moral crusade, and the same kind of sickness that I witnessed in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, and had written a couple columns about it. And the editor of City Lights proposed I put together writings that I'd done on war. I initially refused, but then went back and realized that I had written quite a bit in the last 20 years about war, not about my wars, but I had sought out people who had suffered from being in war, or were cast aside as the human detritus of war because they were physically maimed or crippled or had lost children or whatever, and then put this together. And I have to say, when I went through and did that final read through before we published it, it was a real gut punch, even for me. And I wrote it. But you
I was actually, I kind of wanted to ask you whether putting this together or writing this is it tough for you to put yourself back
It
there?
wasn't as tough as the first one because the first book was really about resurrecting all sorts of memories and trauma that I don't really need to remember. So, I mean, there were days writing the first book where I just was so emotionally overcome I couldn't even work. But it was still visceral, and it's all there. I mean, boiled down to war's essence: corpses when the bodies come home, orphans, the wounds that never heal. You get a look into a window into the reality of war that is carefully sanitized and hidden from the public because if people actually saw war. I mean, the only people who really see war are the people who go to war. I mean, we talk about the images; they're heavily censored. I mean, for instance, when I covered the war in Sarajevo, there was no running water. You had to go to UN had set up common water taps where people would come and fill up their jugs with water. And the Serb gunners consciously targeted those water collection points and then would fire very large shells, 90 millimeter tank rounds, the equivalent of 155 howitzers. And it was just, blow apart human bodies, the legs are severed, etc. Well, what you saw, if you were there, was a carnage that would make you sick. But what you saw on your television screen, which was bad enough, was so heavily censored that you really didn't get a sense. I mean, this has been true in every conflict I've ever covered. I mean, for instance, I went into Kuwait with 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, and the Iraqis who had been cut off from their water for several days were desperate to get water, and they would walk out into the minefields and they'd blow their legs off. You can survive several hours, unfortunately, with your legs blown off, screaming for help. I mean, in real time, we could have set up a satellite feed to show you that, but that's never going to happen. So we don't see war, and the media does a pretty good job of feeding, which they're doing in Ukraine, the mythic narrative of war. It's become a battle of light against dark, a good against evil. Putin is the new Hitler. Ukraine doesn't commit war crimes. I've covered conflict for a long time. I can tell you that both sides lie like they breathe, and war is a very dirty business. So I was glad I put it out just to remind people of what war actually is. And of course, the cynicism of the war in Ukraine, where we're going to destroy the country and make every Ukrainian, or hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Ukrainians bleed to death. For what? I mean, they're going to have to negotiate in the end. But it's not about Ukraine. It's not about democracy. It's not about freedom. It's about degrading Russia. I mean, actually, if you look closely, they're even upfront about it. So I was glad I put the book out just to remind people of the enterprise of death that war is, and what it does to human beings, what it does to families, what it does to societies, and the price and never-ending price for many that you have to pay when you go to war.
Yeah, the cheerleading for what seems to be endless or ongoing war in Ukraine is kind of amazing. I know the word Orwellian is thrown around a lot these days, but it feels very Orwellian to me to watch so many liberals across America, wave Ukrainian flags and act like they stand for Ukraine, when really what the politicians who want them to hold those flags and the point at the core of that is, let's keep this thing going and keep just funding and arming people. And the US and UK through Boris Johnson helped end any peace talks back in April. So it really is. We're at a place where now standing for peace equals war or standing for war equals peace.
Well, this isn't any different than the Bush's call to invade Iraq. I mean, I'd come into the newsroom at the New York Times and the message bank on my phone would be full of death threats. And the only reason there weren't more is because they ran out of room. And nationalism is a disease. I saw it I saw the poison of it around the world. And it's the flip side of nationalism is always bigotry and racism, but it's also self exaltation. I mean, all of this so much, especially after the humiliating defeat in Afghanistan and the debacles in Iraq and Syria and Libya. It's a way for us to resurrect our purity, our moral superiority, our goodness. This has nothing to do really with Ukraine. Most Americans couldn't find Ukraine on a map. It is about the celebration of us as a virtuous, a good people, and a powerful people. And that is a real sickness. It's a sickness that I saw with the wars in the Middle East, and it's the same sickness that we're seeing now. It's also historically it's a way to willfully ignore our own provocations to Russia. I was in Eastern Europe in 1989. I covered the revolutions in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania. I was acutely aware of the promises made to Moscow not to expand NATO beyond the borders of a unified Germany, not to station NATO troops. We now I have 100,000 NATO troops or something in Eastern and Central Europe. And that was really done not for security reasons, because Gorbachev wanted to build a security and economic alliance with Europe and the United States, as did Yeltsin, and people forget, as did Putin in the early years. It was about the belief in this arrogant, hubristic, unipolar world, i.e., after the Cold War, we, the United States, would dominate the globe. And of course, Russia was weakened and crippled and no longer seemed to be a factor that the military establishment had to take into account. And it was also about billions in arms profits, because you have to reconfigure these Soviet bloc armies with NATO compatible equipment. So it's billions and billions and billions in arms sales. So those were the two reasons. It was not in our security interest. I fully believe that Russia would not have, I'm not excusing it, by the way, preemptive war, which this is a criminal war of aggression. But I fully believe that Russia would not have invaded Ukraine if we had not expanded NATO. And I think, especially given Russia's history, it was invaded through Ukraine twice in the last century, first in World War I, second in World War II, the century before that, of course, by Napoleon. There is historical trauma, legitimate historical trauma. And I think they have every right to ask that Ukraine remain a neutral country. I don't think that's an unreasonable request. Even the New York Times has said that the idea that we're going to recapture all of Ukrainian territory, including among the ethnically Russian sections of Ukraine, is folly. These are the New York Times words, not mine. But the war industry, which just leaps from debacle to debacle to debacle, is never held accountable. The pimps of war, the Robert Kagans and Elliot Abrams and Victoria Nulands, it doesn't matter. I mean, Victoria Nuland was Cheney's foreign policy advisor. Now she was in the Obama White House. She's in the Biden White House. These people are just utterly protean, and they're never held to account because they're funded by the war industry. Their think tanks are funded by the war industry. That's why they always have a media platform. I dealt with Abrams and Robert Kagan when I covered the war in El Salvador. They were out working out of the State Department under the Reagan administration, and their primary job was to attempt to discredit everything we were reporting off the ground. That was their job, and they you can't get rid of them. I mean, they're like some anti-virus bacterial strain that never goes away. I mean, the whole lead up to the war in Iraq, I had to listen to these people who knew nothing about the Middle East. I'd been the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. I speak Arabic. I'd spent months of my life in Iraq. I certainly know the instrument of war. But if you didn't parrot back that dominant narrative, you were shut out. It didn't matter how much expertise you had. So the very people they present as quote unquote experts come out of the war industry or the intelligence community. And of course, they're highly paid for this. They're all sitting on the boards of Raytheon or anything else, raking in millions of dollars. So they even have a vested interest in war because it increases the money they make.
Yeah, you have an excellent chapter in your book called "The Pimps of War" about those individuals. And you mentioned earlier. You mentioned the hollowing out of America, and you can really see it with the fact that over 50 billion has already been sent to Ukraine, aid, various types of military aid, and now they're trying to ram through another 50 billion in case the right wing gets the Congress and somehow would block some of that from going to Ukraine. So all told, we're talking $100 billion, and meanwhile, you have in America where people are you've got a million people living on the streets. You have people struggling in a myriad of ways. People don't have food. People don't have it's just crazy that, like, to see that amount of money being sent in some cases to literal Nazis in Ukraine, not exclusively. Meanwhile, you have Americans struggling in so many ways.
Well, that's how empires die. I mean, Arnold Toynbee wrote about this, as did others. They hollow themselves out from the inside. The very violent forms of control they use on the outer reaches of empire migrate back to the homeland. Wholesale surveillance, militarized police, drones, huge prison population. We have the largest prison population in the world, of course. 25% of the world's prisoners, although we're 4% of the world's population. That's Thucydides writes about it. Thucydides writes the tyranny that Athens imposed on others, it imposed on itself. So we're following that trajectory. And you're right, the money is mind-boggling. I mean, we spend $60 billion on the State Department and AID, and that's with terms of military aid and humanitarian assistance, what we've already spent on Ukraine. When you throw in the money that Germany and EU countries have spent, we've already given them $100 billion. And for what? It's it's also the very cavalier attitude they have about provoking a nuclear power. Because remember, on the one hand, Putin's a madman and the new Hitler. On the other hand, they're assuring us he won't use nukes. So you got to have it one way or the other. But you don't provoke. I mean, I never thought I would see the day when I would be holding up Henry Kissinger as a font of wisdom, but he's right.
Yeah.
I mean, we need to negotiate as soon as possible before this thing spins out of control. I've covered enough conflicts to tell you that when you open that Pandora's box of evils, you don't control it. And you saw that in the Middle East. So we have this disastrous plan to arm the quote unquote moderate rebels in Syria. So every member of ISIS and Al Qaeda flocks to Syria to get weapons. And then we realize we've lost control. We've essentially armed the very people we're trying to suppress. So we start bombing them, in essence, working as a de facto air wing of Assad and Hezbollah. Hezbollah was fighting for Damascus. I mean, it's just lunacy. And this is, to suppress the Sunni uprising, we built a tacit, people aren't aware of this, tacit alliance with Iran that sent in probably hundreds of thousands of militias and fighters. I mean, these Sunni extremists got to the gates of Baghdad, and but for Iranian intervention, would have taken over. So it just the whole thing becomes madness, which is true in all wars, and this war will be no different. And the longer it goes on, the more dangerous it becomes. Liberals, I don't understand. I mean, you're right, and any criticism of Ukraine becomes, and I denounced the war publicly, and I assumed I was going to get fired from RT for doing it. They shut down 6 days later, but I didn't think Moscow was going to allow me to have a show where I was running around denouncing the invasion of Ukraine. They don't even use the word invasion.
Yeah, I also said I was opposed to the invasion in the one show I had before it shut down, but I the entire time I was there, 8 years, whatever, 500 some episodes, I had never been told I had to say anything, don't say anything. I wrote every word I said, and that kind of freedom is unheard of on American media channels.
Well, yeah, and the same was true for myself. Most of my show, I was just interviewing authors anyway of books that I liked. It was kind of a snore, but it was what I was into. It was kind of show that should be on like public TV at about 1 in the morning. But I loved it. I mean, I'm a
I
writer,
enjoyed it.
I'm a reader. That's what I am passionate about. And a lot of I know as a writer that it's very hard to get a platform. And the other thing is the people who interview don't read the books, which drives me nuts. So it's just Groundhog Day where you have to do a book report over and over and over. So I always read the books. I mean, and that was a huge commitment of time, which I'm doing now on the Real News. Also goes out on the Substack site. So I'm continuing it. And that's what I did with Telesaur. But yeah, you're right. There was no interference at all. And that gets into another discussion of what's happened to the American media. It's essentially been consolidated, but it's very different from the old media empires where you had like CBS or you had Hearst. Now these are large corporations, the Viacom or whoever owns all this stuff. So news is just one revenue stream out of perhaps hundreds of revenue streams. And it's judged on its ability to compete against other revenue streams. So that's how you have Zucker go into CBS. He's the guy who created the whole fictional persona of Donald Trump on The Apprentice that people ended up voting for. And he turns it into the endless horse race. And if you look at the way they set up the hosts, it's copied from ESPN, where they, sit outside the stadium and you have somebody who supports one football team. And then, of course, they're dredging up all these lowlifes who are barely literate to defend Trump because they have to have somebody fight with Van Jones. I mean, it's just burlesque. It's pathetic. I can't every time I watch it, and I don't have a TV, so I only see it like if I'm at an airport or.
Yeah.
I'm just appalled. I'm appalled. I mean, it's.
I'll turn it on for about a minute every month, and I can't last more than that before I'm just so disgusted that.
Well, they're also so sanctimonious. I mean, it's just outrageous.
Yeah.
How about going after the pharmaceutical industry? How about going after the real engines that have destroyed our corporation? Well, of course, they can't touch them because they're their advertising. I mean, think about CNN. If you watch it, it's like every ad is for somebody who's like totally crippled or diabetic, or makes you wonder who's watching it. But obviously, a lot of people with health issues because their ads are just rife with all sorts of medications I've never heard of.
Well, one of my favorite things that shows you why these media are accountable to these industries is that, like you're saying, half the ads on CNN or Fox News or whatever are pills ads. So big pharma controls a lot of the messaging. Like CNN's not going to bite the hand that feeds it. But then they also have a lot of ads for, or at least some for things like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. And all people have to do is ask themselves, why is that? Is it because a grandma in Poughkeepsie might buy an F-35? Is that... No, it's so these industries have power over these networks.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's, I worked at the New York Times for 15 years. And I was friends with Sidney Schamberg, the great reporter, who was pushed out of the Times, went to the Village Voice. But Sidney used to say, we may not make things better, but maybe we stop things from getting worse. That's kind of how I define. I mean, I was also overseas, so I had a little more freedom. But yeah, there are huge constraints. And Cy Hirsch, probably our greatest investigative journalist, left the Times after he did a huge expose on a company called Gulf and Western, and they were all mobbed up and just awful. And the Times neutered it; they wouldn't print it. And he said, we could still go after power, although we can't anymore. But I realized at that point we couldn't go after corporate America. And that's it. These people get a complete pass, and those are the forces that have destroyed the country and destroyed the democracy. And then politicians like Biden essentially have done their bidding. That's how they rise. I mean, there's a call Biden Senator credit card because the biggest credit card company in Delaware basically funded his Senate campaigns, and by the way, also gave his son Hunter a job. So the system, and Sheldon Wolin, I think, does a very good job of explicating this in his book, Democracy Incorporated, is it's not democratic. I mean, in any real sense of the word, we have the facade of democratic institutions and the rhetoric, but internally, corporations have seized all of the levers of power, including, of course, in the media.
Yeah, yeah. I want to shift gears slightly because there's a lot of great issues we could chat about. Just the other day, and I'll group these two political prisoners together. But just the other day, Mumia Abu Jamal found out that he'd be denied a new trial, despite the fact that entire boxes of evidence were found a couple of years ago that had been hidden from him and his attorneys during the trial. And I know you've worked with him, you know him, and you also know and have worked with Julian Assange. So if you could speak on where things stand for both of them.
It's in the details. So, I mean, when you look closely at the trials of both Mumia and Julian, you recognize the judicial farce that it is. I mean, for instance, at one point, Mumia supposedly confessed to the killing of this police officer, but then the medical record shows that when he supposedly had confessed, he was under anesthesia because he'd also been shot. I mean, stuff like that, and you see
Right.
that with Julian's trial. I mean, the fact that UC Global, which was the Spanish security firm that was essentially working for the CIA, filmed all of Julian's meetings with his attorneys, eviscerating attorney-client privilege, should mean in any court, including a UK court, that the trial's thrown out. But those details don't get out, unfortunately, and so I think most people are unaware of how corrupt the judiciary has become in the service of the security and surveillance state. In the case of Mumia, of course, what he's running up against is the police union, which, if you look closely at it, I live about an hour from Philly and Princeton, is just a white hate group. Uh, and things were so bad in the city under the old mayor Rizzo when Mumia, who was also, like Julian, a journalist, one of the most prominent
Right.
journalists in Philadelphia, and of course the police were furious at the kind of reporting that he was doing, especially on when they burned down the move houses and everything else. I mean, really
Mhm.
courageous and great journalist and brilliant. I know, I visited him; he's brilliant. Uh, and so uh, he was long a target. But the police violence was so egregious that the feds came over and took control of the police department. They were shooting so many black people. That was the climate that Mumia was arrested under. But unfortunately, given the superficial coverage and given the fact that, I mean, one of the things that I've been doing, and I think have managed to accomplish through Ben Cohen with Ben and Jerry's Ice Cream, who's got a small foundation and has been really great on Julian, is making sure that if Julian is extradited, and sadly I think most of us expect him to be extradited, we have good reporters in the courtroom who daily will put out the information so that at least uh, those who are proactive about understanding what's happening can get it. With Chelsea Manning's trial, they wouldn't release transcripts for that reason. And they limited. It's also true with Julian. Very hard to get in the court. I managed to get into the court in London, but I had to get up at 5 a.m. to do it. In Chelsea's trial, they only let 27 people in. So they work very hard to hide because they're fully aware of the judicial anomalies. It's not the best of UK jurisprudence. It's the Lou Bianca, and they just have to trample over the most basic tenets of the law to essentially keep Julian in Belmarsh or keep Mumia in Frackville. That's the prison in Pennsylvania where Mumia is. So, but it is in the details that they expose themselves, which is why they work very hard to hide it. So it's heartbreaking. Both Mumia and Julian have had serious health issues. I think the last I heard, Mumia is a little better. He's had heart surgery. He's had COVID, terrible eczema. Julian is in a very fragile state. He's had many strokes, as anybody would under those conditions. He has had psychotic episodes, hallucinations, this kind of stuff, has contemplated suicide. So, and that's the point. The point is to break them, and everybody has a breaking point. Theirs probably lasted a lot longer than mine would, but that's the point. They know what they're doing. There's a kind of so yeah, I'm glad you brought them both up together. There's certainly two people I admire immensely. I visit Numi, and it's like 6 hours of books. I mean, he puts me to shame in terms of his reading list.
Oh
Yeah.
Yeah, and I saw people in the comment thread mention two other political prisoners, Leonard Peltier and Stephen Donziger, although Donziger is now
Well, Daniel
free.
Hale. Let's not forget Daniel Hale.
And Daniel Hale.
Daniel Hale, who I visited in Marion, and we'll go visit again. As a matter of fact, I've got a letter right here from him. We read books, and then we go up and talk about it. So we read East of Eden, which is a great novel. I hadn't read it. It was a wonderful novel by Steinbeck, and now we're reading Tolstoy. So, but he's in the middle of nowhere. He's in a high security wing. This is, again, someone with a tremendous conscience who saw, as a drone operator, how most of those who were being killed were civilians, including children, and the kind of jocular contempt on the part of other drone operators, calling children they blew away pint-sized terrorists and this kind of stuff, and leaked it. And he's serving 45 months in federal prison. Another really courageous figure. And so, yeah, they're out there, these people with a conscience and courage, but they pay a very high price.
And the case of Donziger is really telling, because it shows if you even just win a prosecution against a company as large as Chevron that owns our many politicians in our government, they've gone after him to, again, similar to Julian, to create a chilling effect. With Julian, it's on journalism. With Donziger, it's on lawyers that will dare prosecute corporate America for their crimes, the indigenous that have been killed in Ecuador by Chevron Texaco. And they essentially turn the prosecution of Donziger over to Chevron's lawyers. It's
well, there you get that, Lee, is again the point I was making before, that when you look at how they have to corrupt even their own law, even their own legal system to carry out these prosecutions, they expose themselves, which is why they make all of this stuff very hard to cover. And we talked about advertising before with CNN. Well, the New York Times set up its own ad company so that people who want to advertise in the paper will have their ads packaged and produced by a New York Times company. And that essentially, of course, gives more money to the paper. Well, who's the largest client in the New York Times ad company? It's Chevron, right. Which is why the coverage of the trial, such as it virtually wasn't any coverage, and what there was reduced to a 600-word wire service, basically a wire service story that didn't say anything. So, there's a kind of stranglehold they have in terms of information. And what they did to Steve is just appalling. And of course, disbarred him and kept him under house arrest. And you're right, in this weird, I don't know how they managed to do this, it turned over his prosecution to a Chevron law firm that was in essence empowered to act on behalf of federal authority.
So we got about 10 minutes left here. To look at the broader picture here, that it feels very evident that the U.S. empire is in its waning days, even if those days last decades.
They won't last decades. Don't worry.
Yeah.
They'll last until the dollar is no longer the world's reserve currency, whenever that is.
Right, which is part of the reason that they viewed the proxy war in Ukraine as so critical to stop the advancement of the China-Russia alliance and Russia allying, working with Germany and France.
It completely backfired. It did the opposite. and it inflicted such economic pain on Europe, which is going to get even worse as the weather gets colder. I think utility bills or heating bills in UK went up 80% in October. So there's again a kind of blowback there, which is going to put heavy strains on the EU, if not on NATO itself, and of course is fueling the far right, as it is in the United States. So, uh, these are again the kind of consequences that come with uh, the use of wholesale violence, and we saw it go all the way back to the $9 billion we gave to the Mujahideen fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. Well, what did that create? I mean, Chambers Johnson has done some tremendous work on this. So, yeah, you're right. It's very counterproductive. I mean, that's I think why Kissinger reacted, because the whole Cold War strategy was to make sure that Washington was closer to Beijing or closer to Moscow than they were to each other. And now you fuse this alliance. You have countries like India, and people aren't buying into the kind of sanctions. So you have Russia with a lot of
80% of the world have apparently live in countries that are not going in for the U.S.
yeah.
sanctions.
Well, that's again, something we never see. I mean, uh, when you actually look at the figures of, for instance, in the Iraq War, how many countries supported us? About six, and they had to like coerce countries like El Salvador and to
Right.
essentially bribe them to do it. I mean, the sanctions on Cuba, we just had a UN vote. The only two countries to oppose it are Israel and the United States. Speaking of pariah countries, and I mean, Israel's just become the Hungary of the Middle East. Uh, and Bibi and these open racists who come out of Kahana and everything else. But this is what happens, and these distortions are not unique to the United States. Viktor Orban, Marie Le Pen polled 41% of the vote. You have the far right in Sweden, where you are. And that's a tragedy, because in the 70s, Sweden essentially eradicated poverty. I mean, it was and that was done through strikes and the power of labor, all of which was rolled back. So the neoliberalism creates the same deformities, which we are about to get hit with tomorrow, and I sadly suspect in 2024. Whether it's Trump, doesn't really matter who it is. It's whether it's DeSantis or Pompeo or I don't know, but that is where we're headed, and we are headed there because the ruling elites betrayed both Republicans and Democrats, working men and women, the poor, and the rest of us, on behalf of global corporations, which is who they work for, and now we're all going to pay for it. And then we haven't even talked about climate change.
I know. I actually was thinking, should I try and squeeze that in here? You mentioned the reserve currency, the petrodollar. The fact that it is that most oil is still sold and bought in dollars gives the dollar its power. And I haven't heard that many people talk about the fact that that means that the most powerful, richest country in the world has a huge reason, the motivation to make sure this world never switches off of oil, because that would kill our dollar and our power. And so through all this discussion of climate change and Cop Out 27 and all this stuff, like there seems to be no discussion of what the petrodollar means and the reason the U.S. doesn't really want to support any kind of shift away from fossil fuels.
Well, there's that, but it's also SWIFT. So your exchange currency, your international exchange currency, is done through the dollar. So you have Russia and China essentially attempting to set up an alternative to SWIFT. Iran doesn't use dollars, so there are shifts, and we know what will happen, because the pound sterling was the world's reserve currency until the 1950s, and once it switched to the dollar, the UK went into a severe depression. People don't want. I mean, treasury bonds are not worth anything anymore. China, which holds massive amounts of debt, and then the dollar falls precipitously. I don't know how much. I'm not an economist, but it falls to a third or whatever of its value, and you can't sustain the empire in essence, because the empire is sustained on debt. It doesn't work anymore. And then you got real problems with, of course, further accelerating the economic crisis at home. So when does it come in? Alfred McCoy gives a year, 2030. Very brave of him. I wouldn't do that. Uh, but certainly we're inching towards this, at least a multipolar financial system, and then the empire is not sustainable. Um, so yeah, of course, the fossil fuel industry. You can't, I would say you can't vote. No matter who you vote for, you can't vote against the interests of Goldman Sachs or Chevron. It's not possible. It doesn't matter whether they're Republican or Democrat. I mean, they have essentially seized control of the economies of Western nations. We don't have control over our own economy anymore, nor does any country in Europe, and that's of course the problem. So you disenfranchise
Yeah.
so many people, and then they start searching for these con artists and demagogues, and that is what I saw in Yugoslavia. The war in Yugoslavia was caused by the economic meltdown of Yugoslavia. It had nothing to do with ancient ethnic hatreds at all. Um, those were resurrected in the same way that neo-Confederates have resurrected them. And I was in Montgomery a couple of years ago with Brian Stevenson. We were walking through Montgomery. Montgomery's 50% of Montgomery's black. That's the birth of the civil rights movement, King, Rosa Parks. And there were all these Confederate memorials everywhere, including when you drive into Montgomery, this gigantic flag, used car dealerships fly. I mean, I didn't even make flags that big, a Confederate flag. And Brian was saying, well, all of these have been put up in the last 10 years. And I said, well, that's exactly what happened in Yugoslavia. When you essentially rupture the social bonds, people lose a sense of identity, and then they seek identity in this ethnic chauvinism. And that's exactly what's happened, especially the white working class. And I speak as someone who comes out of the white working class. Certainly on my mother's side of the family, they're all from Maine, all working class. I've seen what's happened to those towns. All the mills are closed, and the bank in my grandparents' town, what was my grandparents' town, is boarded up. And what's happened? They methamphetamine, prison, and they already had enough guns to stoke a secessionist movement on their own. It's fed into this rage that is exploited by figures like Trump, and it will be expressed in a kind of Christianized fascism. I wrote a book on it, which people should look at, American Fascists, the Christian Right in the War in America, because that is our authentically fascist movement. I'm a seminary graduate, by the way. It's not a Hitchens, so I couldn't stand slam on religion. These people are heretics. They've fused the iconography and language of the worst aspects of white supremacy, imperialism, capitalism with a Christian religion, essentially sanctifying it. And Trump has no ideology. It's just a void, and they fill that vacuum. But that's what waits in the wings. And I think if you saw on January 6th, the connecting tissue between these disparate militia groups, QAnon, it was this kind of Christian fascism. And I think that's where we're headed.
Do you see any meaning in the fact that is happening, that tendency, that movement is happening at the same time that we see liberal America, including the New York Times and Washington Post, and everyone basically, I don't know, laundering brand laundering for the Azov Battalion and these neo-Nazi groups?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's what that gets into a whole discussion of why liberals are allowed to exist in a capitalist democracy. Chomsky's written the best book on this, although I did write a book called Death of the Liberal Class. Well, liberals are permitted to exist in a capitalist democracy as long as they never critique the virtues. They can critique the excesses, but not the virtues. So you start critiquing the superstructure itself, then you're pushed out. And they posit themselves as the kind of moral arbiter of society. I live in Princeton there. That's why I don't talk to any of them now that Cornel West has moved to New York. So, yeah, I don't like liberals, actually. When I was in seminary at Harvard, I lived in Roxbury, ran a small church there across from a housing project. So I had to commute into class with classmates who would talk about empowering people they never met. That's kind of the liberal class. Um, so yeah, they look. The liberals were the cheerleaders for the war in Iraq, and quite effective cheerleaders for the war, and they were really used quite effectively to shut me down. I was on Terry Gross. I think it was Terry Gross's show. I don't remember. At the day they invaded Iraq, I had 15 minutes to talk about why we shouldn't invade Iraq. I didn't know who was coming next. I know Michael. We've known Michael for years. Next thing, it's Michael Ignatieff talking about how he opposed the Vietnam War and humanitarian intervention. Well, they were, and I talked to Michael later. Bush invited him down to the White House and all that kind of stuff. They're Lenin got it. They're useful idiots, and every time a war rolls around, they whip out the American flag. I think Todd Gitlin was hanging one off his balcony up at Columbia for the first Iraq War. But as I said before, nationalism in whatever form it comes is a disease or a poison that I know very well. And liberals are as susceptible to it, unfortunately, as everyone else, and they become very effective tools in terms of selling the war. And you're right. I mean, it's absolutely shameless and indefensible what they have done over Ukraine. But keeps them on MSNBC, I guess. You want to go on MSNBC?
Yeah. Well, I can't thank you enough for doing this with me. It's really been a pleasure, and keep up all the great work. The book is The Greatest Evil is War, and the show is the Chris Hedges Report, right?
Yeah, chrishedges.substack.com, and then The Real News puts it out every Friday on their website.
Well, thank you so much, and I hope to see you soon.
Okay, take care.
Take care. All right, everybody. That was the incomparable Chris Hedges. Please support this show. If you want to see me do more interviews like this, more hour-long deep dive interviews, then please support Mint Press, support Behind the Headlines. You can go to patreon.com/behindtheheadlines. Mint Press, if you haven't heard of them, amazing news outlet that I've been working with for this show and for my other show, The Most Censored News. So please, if you want to see this keep going, share it, like it, put a comment. All of those things, and support us on Patreon. The link is in the comment thread. All right. I'll see you next week. Keep fighting. When my guest is likely going to be Stephen Donziger, who we talked about in this episode.